The year is 1945. World War II, a conflict that engulfed the globe, has finally come to an end. Victory is declared, but peace remains elusive. Nowhere is this more apparent than on the Korean peninsula. For decades, Korea had endured the yoke of Japanese imperialism. Now, with Japan's defeat, Korea finds itself at the mercy of new powers. In the north, the Soviet Union casts a long shadow, supporting the rise of a communist regime under Kim Il-sung. To the south, the United States backs a democratic government led by Syngman Rhee. A nation once united is now cleaved in two, a microcosm of the burgeoning Cold War. The 38th parallel, a line drawn on a map with little regard for the intricate tapestry of Korean history and culture, becomes a stark demarcation line. Families are torn apart, their hopes for a unified homeland dashed against the rocks of ideological division. The seeds of conflict have been sown, and it won't be long before they sprout into the maelstrom of war. The division of Korea was never meant to be permanent. It was intended as a temporary measure, a way to manage the transition from Japanese rule to Korean independence. But the lofty ideals of a unified Korea quickly fell victim to the realities of the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union, each suspicious of the other's intentions, viewed Korea as a pawn in their global chess match. Both superpowers sought to expand their spheres of influence, and Korea, strategically located in Northeast Asia, became a focal point of this struggle. In the north, Kim Il-sung consolidated his power, ruthlessly suppressing any opposition and aligning his country firmly with the Soviet Union and Communist China. He envisioned a unified Korea under his communist banner and was determined to achieve this goal by force if necessary. To the south, Syngman Rhee, though committed to democracy, was equally determined to unify Korea under his rule. He too was not averse to using force, believing that the South, with the backing of the United States, could prevail in a military confrontation. With each passing day, the rhetoric grew more bellicose. The drums of war beat louder, and the fragile peace on the Korean peninsula edged closer to the precipice. The early hours of June 25, 1950, shattered the uneasy truce on the Korean peninsula. North Korean forces, armed with Soviet tanks and artillery, surged across the 38th parallel in a surprise attack. The invasion, swift and brutal, caught the South Korean army off guard. Seoul, the capital of South Korea, fell to the communists within days. The United States, caught unawares by the North Korean aggression, sprang into action. President Harry Truman, fearing the fall of South Korea would embolden communist forces around the world, vowed to repel the invasion. The United Nations, newly formed in the aftermath of World War II, condemned the North Korean invasion as an act of aggression. The Security Council, with the Soviet Union noticeably absent, passed a resolution authorizing the use of force to repel the North Koreans and restore peace to the peninsula. What began as a regional conflict quickly escalated into a proxy war between the superpowers, a dangerous new chapter in the unfolding drama of the Cold War. The initial North Korean offensive was relentless. South Korean and American forces, outnumbered and outgunned, fought valiantly but were forced to retreat southward. By August 1950, the defenders of South Korea found themselves clinging to a precarious foothold in the southeast corner of the peninsula, a perimeter centered around the port city of Pusan. The situation was dire. The Pusan perimeter, as it became known, was all that stood between the North Korean army and total victory. American troops, rushed to Korea from bases in Japan, poured into the perimeter, reinforcing their beleaguered South Korean allies. The defenders of the Pusan perimeter fought with incredible courage and tenacity, repelling wave after wave of North Korean attacks. The United States Air Force and Navy, operating from carriers offshore, unleashed their firepower on the advancing enemy, slowing their advance and buying precious time for the defenders. The stand at Pusan was a testament to the determination of the United Nations forces and a crucial turning point in the war. It prevented the North Koreans from achieving a quick victory and allowed time for the United States and its allies to amass the forces necessary to launch a counteroffensive. Section 5, Turning the Tide at Incheon. As the defenders fought desperately to hold on at Pusan, General Douglas MacArthur, the flamboyant and audacious commander of United Nations forces, devised a daring plan. He envisioned a surprise amphibious landing at Incheon, a strategic port city well behind enemy lines and just a short distance from Seoul. The Incheon landing, if successful, would outflank the North Koreans, cut their supply lines and throw their entire offensive into disarray. On September 15, 1950, under the cover of darkness and a heavy naval bombardment, American Marines stormed ashore at Incheon. The landing, brilliantly executed, caught the North Koreans completely by surprise. Within days, Incheon was secured, and United Nations forces began their advance towards Seoul. The North Korean army, caught off guard and facing the prospect of being trapped, began a hasty retreat back across the 38th parallel. The Incheon landing was a stunning victory for the United Nations forces, a masterstroke of military planning and execution that reversed the tide of the war. Section 6. China enters the fray. With the tide of the war turning in their favor, the United States and its allies made the fateful decision to cross the 38th parallel and pursue the retreating North Korean army. The goal was to unify Korea under a democratic government, but this decision would have far-reaching consequences. China, fearing a UN army on its border, issued a stern warning that it would not tolerate foreign troops near its territory. The warnings, however, went unheeded. In late October 1950, as UN forces neared the Yalu River, the border between North Korea and China, hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops surged across the border, launching a massive counter-offensive. The Chinese intervention, unexpected and overwhelming, caught the UN forces off guard. Outnumbered and outmaneuvered, the UN forces were forced to retreat southward, abandoning their hard-won gains. The war had entered a new and even more dangerous phase. Section 7. Stalemate and attrition. The Chinese intervention transformed the Korean War. What had begun as a conflict between North and South Korea had escalated into a major international conflict, with the United States and China, the world's most populous nation, locked in a bloody stalemate. For the next 2 years, the war raged on, with neither side able to achieve a decisive victory. The front lines stabilized near the 38th parallel, and the war settled into a brutal pattern of trench warfare, reminiscent of the First World War. Both sides dug in, constructing elaborate defensive positions. Casualties mounted on both sides as soldiers faced constant artillery barrages, sniper fire, and hand-to-hand combat. The Korean War had become a war of attrition, a grinding conflict with no end in sight. Section 8. Armistice and division. By 1953, with the war dragging on and no end in sight, both sides were ready for peace. Negotiations for an armistice began at Panmunjom, a small village in the Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ, that separated the two Koreas. The talks were long and arduous, marked by suspicion and mistrust. Finally, on July 27, 1953, an armistice agreement was signed. The agreement ended the fighting and established the DMZ, a heavily fortified buffer zone along the 38th parallel. However, a formal peace treaty was never signed, leaving North and South Korea technically still at war. The Korean War had ended, but the Korean peninsula remained divided, a lasting legacy of the Cold War. Section 9. The Korean War's enduring legacy. The Korean War, though often overshadowed by other conflicts of the Cold War, left an indelible mark on the world. It solidified the division of Korea, leaving the peninsula a flashpoint of tension and a reminder of the human cost of ideological conflict. The war also had a profound impact on the Cold War itself. The Korean War demonstrated the willingness of the United States to intervene militarily to contain the spread of communism. This commitment, known as containment, would shape American foreign policy for decades to come. The war also marked the emergence of China as a major military power, a development that would have far-reaching consequences for the region and the world. The Korean War, though officially over, continues to cast a long shadow over the Korean peninsula and the world. It serves as a reminder of the human cost of war, the dangers of ideological division, and the need for peaceful resolution to conflict.